theory of hegemonic transition is one which is premised upon the idea that the world order is a hierarchical order, and that the major powers at the top, or sometimes a major hegemon at the top, are the ones that set the rules about how resources will be distributed, what are the conditions for the international system, and that those that are then the second or third tier powers, they are either satisfied with those arrangements or they're dissatisfied. And so the theory goes that if a rising power is dissatisfied, then at some point they may challenge through war or through conflict the hegemonic power. The United States, some would characterize since the end of the Second World War as the global hegemonic power. The Americans would say a benevolent hegemon, and I think many would, but say it's the hegemonic power. And now China proving to be the challenger to that hegemonic order. So there's the great debate whether or not then the rise of China will pose a threat to global order and could result in war between the United States and China. Graham Allison makes the case that in world history, if we look since the 1500s, there's been 16 cases in which there's been a rising power that's challenged the global hegemon of the time. Graham writes that in 12 of 16 of those instances, it's led to conflict between the hegemonic power and the rising contender. So people ask the question, could the same happen between the rising challenger, China, and the status quo power, the hegemon of the United States?
The last great hegemonic transition was between Great Britain as a world empire and the United States. It happened in a war, but that war was not between Britain and the United States. It was a war in which Britain and the United States were on the same side, fighting Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. And the transition was peaceful because there was simply no possibility of the British fighting for the retention of power. And indeed, the British had acquired power in a very similar process from the Dutch Empire. The Dutch ran out of money, the British took over. So not all hegemonic transitions lead to war. Wise retiring hegemons recognize their weakness and step off the stage and accept that they are no longer in charge. And we see this throughout history. There have been wars about hegemonic transition, but these are wars between countries that are very similar. So the possibility is that a future hegemonic transition would be more economic than military. The indicators might be military, but in an age of nuclear weapons, that kind of war would be very counterproductive. Destroying the world in order to rule over it would be foolish beyond belief. And fortunately, the governments of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the West, and now China are rational governments. They're not going to do that.
그렇다면 과연 중국은 미국을 대신할 수 있을까요? 아니, 대신하게 된다고 하더라도 과연 언제쯤 그런 일이 가능할까요?
The United States will remain the largest power through the 21st century. I've written a book called The Future of Power, looking at how power is shifting in the 21st century. And I argue that you do see a shift in power in the global economy from west to east, and that Asia is recovering what you might call its normal proportion of the world economy. But that doesn't mean that China will be more powerful than the United States. China will have a larger economy in total GDP, but it will not have a larger economy in terms of per capita income. And that per capita income is often a better measure of the sophistication of an economy. In addition to that, we look at not just at economic power, but when you look at military power and soft power, the United States is well ahead of China. So I have no idea what will happen by the end of the century. I will not be around to find out. But I think over the next middle decades of the 21st century, the Americans will remain the largest power on all three dimensions of economic, military, and soft power.
So power does pass, you know it when it's happened. You can't actually be sure as it's happening that it is happening and where it will end up. But the challenge from China is important. It's evident, and China's always been a big power in East Asia, even when it's been in disruption. Now it's being seen as a big power further afield, in trade, but also in military power as well, and influence. Whether it challenges the United States for top position yet is another matter. I think probably not. And not necessarily, it's not necessarily going to come to that. There can be a sort of equilibrium between the two.
The idea that China will replace the United States begs two questions. Does China want to be the world hegemon? And I think the answer there is definitely not. And secondly, do the Americans wish to give up being the world hegemon? And I think there again the answer is no. I have discussed this with leading Chinese scholars as well. I think what's clear is the Chinese wish to have much of what the Americans have: wealth, influence, high living standards, many of the things that we associate with the United States. The problem is China is a one-party state. It is not an open and liberal democracy, and the basis of American strength is liberal democracy and the consent of the people. The Chinese authorities cannot achieve this without opening up the political process. And the real concerns of China are not global hegemony, but internal stability. China is more concerned to keep the Communist Party in power than it is to achieve dominance over the rest of the world. And so for the foreseeable future, the United States will remain the world hegemon. It would take the Chinese at least 50 years to match what the Americans have now in terms of technology, weapons, power.
조만간 중국이 미국을 대신할 수 있을지, 혹은 많은 학자들이 이야기하는 것처럼 상당히 오랜 시간이 걸릴지는 사실 지금으로서는 알 수 없습니다. 하지만 중요한 것은 지금이 매우 유동적인 시기라는 점입니다. 마치 중원국가와 북방 유목민족 사이에서 마의 삼각구조 하에 놓여있던 고려처럼 말입니다. 하지만 고려는 현명한 외교 전략으로 평화와 국가의 자율성을 모두 지킬 수 있었습니다. 그렇다면 지금 우리가 평화와 국가의 자율성을 지키기 위해 반드시 명심해야 할 것들은 무엇일까요?
The greatest problem facing Korea at present is uncertainty. Nobody likes uncertainty, particularly when there are nuclear weapons involved. So finding a position in which the national interest can be upheld, security can be maintained, and the important things like the rule of law, democratic freedoms, and security of the individual can be sustained is going to be very difficult. There are obvious ways of responding to this threat. The imposition of a security state, the militarization of South Korean societies, a more symmetrical response to North Korea. This would be the wrong solution. The solution is to carry on doing what is being done, to continue being part of the Western democratic liberal collective, continuing to trade, to do all of those things. Because the West, for all of its uncertainties and its lack of coherence, is all looking in the same direction. So this is not the time for hardline militaristic responses. The problem is getting the North Korean regime to talk, and at the moment that is the problem. In my estimation, the North Korean regime is essentially like a small naughty child that seeks some attention by misbehaving. We've all noticed this behaviour. Do we ignore it and hope it will go away, or do we punish it and thereby validate it? So the response is difficult. It's a classic parenting problem. How do you deal with a badly behaved child?
But the best recommendation I could give to the Republic of Korea, but one that has followed over the decades, is to stay internally strong, invest in your own defense, and when you make your choices of partners, to think carefully about what are the interests of those powers the core interests, not as you wish them to be, but what are the interests of those powers. So the alliance that we've had between the United States and the Republic of Korea since the 1950s has been one in which our alignment of interest has been so close. It's been an extraordinarily formidable alliance. It's interests that are based upon opposition during the Cold War to the Soviet-led communist bloc, opposition to the North Korean regime and what it stood for, and now we see an increasing diffusion of power. So for the Republic of Korea, I think that a sound strategy is to ensure that it doesn't overly focus on the great powers and the powers within its neighborhood, and the ability to identify new emerging centers such as Southeast Asia, ASEAN, India, and then to cultivate relations with that, because it allows Korea to internationalize this issue. And rather than it just being an issue between the United States, China, North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, a strategy in which it takes this very threatening issue and it tries to internationalize it and find partners around the world to help.
Japan, it would include Australia, it would include perhaps Vietnam, it would include perhaps Singapore. I worry sometimes when I talk to my Korean friends that there's an obsession with the Korean Peninsula and with North Korea, or an obsession with the United States and China, and there's a frustration with the conservative quality of the Japanese government and issues like history, historical memory, the comfort women. All of those things tend to set up a distance between South Korea and Japan. But I think if Korea wants to think seriously about its foreign policy from a strategic standpoint, it needs to look for adding to its friends and doing its best to improve relations with countries like Australia or Vietnam or Japan. I realize Japan does not make this easy, and Prime Minister Abe has been, and many of the people with him, have been unfairly refusing to acknowledge some of the negative parts of Japan's history in the past. But I also think that there are very good strategic reasons for Japan and South Korea to try to resolve those history issues.
If there is a big power quarrel between the United States and China, Korea is a medium-sized country. It wants good relations with America and good relations with China. So Koreans will say, oh, please, please, in Washington and Beijing, will you be sensible? Don't have big antagonism, because we are a medium-sized country in the middle. We get hurt if big guys go jumping around. There's an old saying in Africa, if the two elephants go stomping on the ground shakes also for us. So what is Korea's future to be? What's a wise policy for Korea? Keep investing in your education, keep investing in your technology, keep perhaps a surplus currency, but perhaps it shouldn't be so high. Perhaps you need to invest a bit more in smarter places, in, say, Italian industry and Brazilian industry. That, in my view, would be smart. Always go for diplomacy. Do not let your Korean national interest be insulted, but always go for diplomacy. Medium-sized country always wants diplomacy.
얼마 전까지 한국의 안보와 외교는 미국과의 관계만 생각하면 된다고 생각할 수 있었습니다. 이제 그거는 더 이상 통할 수가 없게 되었습니다. 그런 의미에서 한국의 외교는 전환점에 서 있다고 말할 수가 있겠죠. 원교 근공의 논리가 통할 수 있는 시대는 이제 끝났습니다. 원교 근친의 대전략을 발전시켜야 합니다. 우리가 전환점에 서 있다고 말할 수 있는 또 한 가지 이유는 이제 남한만으로는 한국의 발전과 성숙이 한계에 봉착했다는 것이죠. 한반도 차원의 평화적인 통합이 없이는 한국 사회의 더 이상의 발전과 성숙은 기대하기 어려운 지점에 서 있다고 생각이 됩니다.